The White Tower, as it was originally known, was a fortress-stronghold built by the first Norman king, William the Conqueror. It was intended to protect against foreign invasion and intimidate the citizens of London in equal measure. But the tower also had other uses. It operated as a royal residence and was where monarchs would stay as they awaited their coronation. However, the Tower of London's most famous role, one that it played for over 850 years, was as a prison. Detaining a list of people that included Sir William Wallace in 1305, Anne Boleyn and her daughter, the future Queen of England Elizabeth I in the mid-16th century, and in the 19th century the deputy leader of the Nazi Party Rudolf Hess, along with East End gangsters Ronnie and Reggie Cray in the 1950s. Here are just some of the prisoners kept within its 27-meter high walls during the Middle Ages. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Moat, Menagerie and Mint. Building work began in the 1070s by William I just after the Norman invasion as a show of power. Eventually, the White Tower was the innermost keep or donjon of 3 enclosures as the area was expanded by various monarchs who added walls, towers and a moat. Over the years, it has served as an armory, a treasury, a public records office, home to the Royal Mint, and a menagerie. It was thought that King John I introduced wild animals to the tower in the 1330s, as records dated from that period refer to lion keepers. Henry III was given 3 leopards by the Holy Roman Emperor and a polar bear that went fishing in the River Thames by the King of Norway. But it was during the Middle Ages that the tower had a revolving door of prisoners. Let's meet a few of them now. Ranulf Flambard, Bishop of Durham. Ranulf has the great claim of being the very first prisoner to escape from the Tower of London in 1100. Ranulf began working under King William I and probably had a role in the creation of the Domesday Book in 1086. He was also the keeper of the King's Seal. When William died, his son William Rufus inherited the throne and Ranulf became involved in the finances of the kingdom. He was a sort of Chief Justice of England, and at one point he administered to 16 bishoprics and abbeys. He was then made Bishop of Durham as a reward. But then King Rufus died and Henry I came to power. Now Ranulf found himself a scapegoat for the extravagances of Rufus's reign, and he was imprisoned in the Tower of London on charges of embezzlement. He may have been the first prisoner, but he was also the first escapee. So the story goes, Ranulf had his friends smuggle in a flagon of wine which he gave to the guards. After they became drunk and fell asleep, Ranulf descended from the window of his cell by rope and escaped across the English Channel by boat. After spending time in exile in Normandy, Ranulf was pardoned and returned to England to help complete the building of Durham Cathedral. He was buried in the chapter house there in 1128. William Fitz Osbert. William was a Londoner who took up the role of spokesperson for the poor. Educated at university, he had been on the Third Crusade and was quite the charismatic figure. Nicknamed the Bearded, Fitz Osbert was of ready wit, moderately skilled in literature, and elegant beyond measure, and wishing to make himself a great name, he began to scheme upon the achievement of mighty plans. Town riots were rare in the 12th and 13th century England, but in the spring of 1196, murmurings of an uprising began. Fitz Osbert was stirring the mob with his speeches and began, quote, "a powerful conspiracy inspired by the zeal of the poor against the insolence of the rich." With 52,000 followers and a stockpile of weaponry, the Archbishop of Canterbury knew that Fitz Osbert had to be stopped. After taking refuge in the Church of St Mary Le Bow in Cheapside, Fitz Osbert was smoked out, arrested and taken to the Tower. Within a few days, he was, quote, "first drawn asunder by horses, and then hanged on a gibbet with 9 of his accomplices who refused to desert him." He was the first person to be executed at Tyburn, which later became the main site for executions in London. Gruffudd ap Llywelyn. Prince Gruffudd was the eldest son of Llywelyn the Great, King of Gwynedd, Wales. On the death of his father, his younger brother Dafydd was proclaimed heir, and Gruffudd was held prisoner by his brother, who feared reprisals. When King Henry III of England held a successful invasion of the Welsh border, Dafydd handed his brother over into the king's custody as surety of his good behaviour. So Gruffudd and his eldest son were taken to London and kept in the Tower as King Henry's guests. Like Ranulf Flambard before him, Gruffudd made his escape by using a rope and lowering himself down the tower walls from his window. but the rope was improvised from sheets and clothing, and Gruffudd was a well-built man. The rope broke, and he fell to his death. Sir William Wallace. Hugely famous due to the movie Braveheart, Wallace was a Scottish knight who became a leader during the First War of Scottish Independence. Although vastly outnumbered, he defeated the army of King Edward I of England at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, but was himself defeated a year later at the Battle of Falkirk. Betrayed, he was turned over to the English. After being taken to London, Wallace was tried for treason and committing crimes against civilians. He was imprisoned at the Tower for a short time before being stripped naked and dragged by horse, quote, "through the middle of the city to Smithfield, hanged there and afterwards drawn. The heart, liver and lung and all the internal parts dispatched to the fire and burned, before being beheaded and decapitated, the body cut up and divided into 4 quarters, the head affixed upon London Bridge. The other 4 pieces of his body were, quote, hung on the gibbet in Newcastle upon Tyne, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, as a cause of fear and chastisement of all going past and looking upon these things." Richard II of England. Richard was in trouble. The poll tax demands of 1381 had set off the peasants' revolt, and now the 14-year-old boy king was forced to shelter within the confines of the Tower of London. Richard tried to leave by sailing down the Thames, but the crowds of rebels were too thick along the banks of the river, so he was unable to land and had to return to the safety of the tower once again. Eventually, the rebels were defeated, but it was not the last time that Richard would find himself in a spot of bother. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, grandson of King Edward III, invaded England. He met with little resistance. Richard was not well liked, so Henry deposed him and had himself crowned. Richard was taken to the Tower, this time as a prisoner. After being transported to Pontefract Castle, Richard died in mysterious circumstances. It is possible that he was murdered by being starved to death whilst held captive. Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. Henry came to the English throne at just 9 months old after the death of his warrior father Henry V. Born during the 3rd phase of the 100 Years' War, he was the only English monarch ever crowned King of France. From 1453, Henry had a series of mental breaks, and his wife Queen Margaret took advantage of the situation to make herself de facto leader. Henry's cousin Richard, Duke of York, challenged Margaret, and the dispute over the succession of the English throne led to the Civil War of 1455, later known as the Wars of the Roses. York's eldest son, Edward IV, took the throne after defeating Margaret's Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, where the couple's only son was killed. Henry was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London along with his wife after having lost his wits, his 2 kingdoms, and his only son. He mysteriously died there, possibly smothered to death as he slept. Margaret was later released and returned to France. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. George was the 3rd surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, and the brother of English kings Edward IV and Richard III. Despite being only 12 years old, George was made Duke of Clarence and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland when his elder brother Edward became king in 1461. Despite this, George went against his family and joined his father-in-law Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, when he switched sides to support Margaret of Anjou and the House of Lancaster during the Wars of the Roses. Realizing his mistake, Clarence reconciled with his family, but his mental health deteriorated rapidly after the death of his wife. It wasn't long before he was accused of unnatural, loathly treason against his brother King Edward, and George was arrested and confined to the Tower of London, where he was privately executed in 1479. Traditionally, it is said that Clarence was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. King Edward V and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. King Edward IV's heirs, Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, were just 12 and 9 when they were confined to the royal lodgings of the Tower by their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was England's regent, and Edward was housed at the Tower before his coronation in May of 1483, but the event was postponed and young Edward was never crowned as Parliament proclaimed all of the children of Edward IV as illegitimate. Richard was quickly crowned in his place as King Richard III. The 2 boys were seen playing together in the Tower Garden during that summer, but then they were never seen alive again. Were they murdered, smothered to death, as Sir Thomas More, the Lord High Chancellor to King Henry VIII stated, to secure Richard's claim to the throne? Did they die from an illness, or were they quietly shipped abroad? 2 small skeletons were found at the tower in 1674 and placed in an urn at Westminster Abbey by order of King Charles II. The coffins of 2 unknown children were also found at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, but neither those nor the ones from the tower have ever been proven to be the remains of the royal boys. The missing brothers became known as the Princes in the Tower, and what happened to them is a historical mystery that still divides people today. Perkin Warbeck. We travel right to the end of the medieval period to meet our final Tower of London prisoner. After Richard III was killed in battle, the last English king to do so at Bosworth Field, it was Henry Tudor's turn to claim the throne in 1485. Henry the Lancastrian was now monarch, and the Wars of the Roses were finally over after 40 years. Henry even cemented his claim by marrying Elizabeth of York, older sister to the 2 princes in the Tower. But the threat to Henry's kingship lingered on in the form of a pretender to the throne named Perkin Warbeck. Warbeck claimed to be the youngest of the 2 princes in the Tower, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, brother to the Queen. Due to the ambiguity over what became of the 2 young boys and a lack of medieval DNA tests, it was difficult to prove otherwise. Warbeck had a supporter in his aunt, Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy. She helped to fund a small army and paid for transport across the Channel to ferry Warbeck's forces, but after landing in England they were met by fierce opposition and forced to abandon the assault. Warbeck surrendered and was paraded through the streets of London to the Tower. He confessed to being an imposter and was taken to Tyburn, where he was executed. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, have a great week. Cheers!